Welcome. Close your eyes and let the story unfold. Tonight, we journey into the gilded halls of history, where queens and kings faced choices that shaped the fate of nations. Settle into your comfort, let the world drift away, and if you enjoy this journey through time, don't forget to subscribe for more whispered tales of history and intrigue. Now, let us enter the Tuileries and follow the steps of Marie Antoinette as Paris stirs around her. The night air over Versailles was soft as velvet, perfumed with roses from the royal gardens and the faint hum of fountains still whispering in the dark. Inside the gilded palace, 1,000 candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, their reflections trembling across endless mirrors. Marie Antoinette stood alone at her balcony, the silk of her gown breathing with the wind. Below her, the distant laughter of courtiers drifted from the Hall of Mirrors, a sound once comforting, now hollow. She had been queen for nearly 2 decades, yet in that moment, she felt more like a ghost wandering her own kingdom. From this very balcony she had once watched fireworks bloom across the summer sky, symbols of France's glory and her youth's carelessness. But now, there were murmurs. The same people who once cheered her name whispered of hunger, of taxes, of bread. A knock came at her door, soft, hesitant. "Your Majesty," said Madame Campan, her most trusted attendant. "It is late. His Majesty retires. Should I help you undress?" Marie turned slowly, her jewels shimmering like drops of water. "No, Campan," she said gently. "Leave me the candles. I wish to stay a little longer." As the door closed, the queen sank into the velvet chair by the window. The distant sound of hooves echoed faintly, someone leaving the palace at night. A messenger, perhaps. Or something darker. She did not know yet that this was the beginning of her sleepless nights, that history had already begun to turn its gaze toward her. She lifted her hand to her neck, where a single pearl rested, a wedding gift from a world that once adored her. Outside, the fountains murmured on, as if reluctant to tell her what they already knew. Before she was Queen of France, she had been Maria Antonia, the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Vienna had smelled of lilacs and parchment then, the halls of Schönbrunn Palace alive with tutors, diplomats, and the rustle of silk. Her mother ruled an empire with a mind sharper than any blade, and though she loved her daughter, she treated her as a pawn in a grand design. At 14, Maria Antonia was told she would marry the Dauphin of France. The words fell like a decree from the heavens, irreversible, unchallengeable. She did not yet speak fluent French, nor understand the intricate etiquette of Versailles, where a single misplaced glance could become a scandal. But her mother's eyes left no room for doubt. "You will charm them, my daughter. You will make Austria proud." Her journey from Vienna to France was a ceremony of rebirth. At the border, she was stripped of every Austrian garment, even her beloved dog, Mops. From this moment, they said, "You are no longer Maria Antonia. You are Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France." The French court awaited her with equal parts fascination and suspicion. Some whispered that she was too young, too foreign, too frivolous. Yet when she first entered Versailles, her golden curls catching the sunlight through the high windows, even the most cynical courtiers paused. She was radiant, like a promise of a new age. Louis Auguste, her betrothed, stood beside her, awkward, kind, his face soft with shyness. He barely met her gaze. But when he finally did, something unspoken passed between them, not love, not yet, but the faint recognition of two souls equally unprepared for the crowns awaiting them. That night, alone in her new chambers, Marie stared at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The girl from Vienna had vanished. In her place stood the future Queen of France, beautiful, fragile, and already surrounded by eyes that did not blink. Versailles was not merely a palace, it was a stage. Every gesture, every word, every breath of perfume was part of a silent performance that never ended. The Dauphine soon learned that even her smiles were judged as strategy. When she laughed too freely, they whispered that she lacked dignity. When she was quiet, they accused her of pride. At 16, Marie Antoinette entered this glittering labyrinth where every glance carried meaning. The courtiers studied her as though she were a rare bird, lovely, exotic, but not entirely trusted. They bowed deeply, murmured their compliments, and then retreated to whisper behind their fans. Her husband, the Dauphin Louis Auguste, was gentle and awkward, more interested in locks and hunting than in politics, or in his young wife. At dinner, he spoke little, and when he did, it was often to his plate. The court noticed. So did his grandfather, King Louis XV, who chuckled quietly at their shy distance. The pressure on the young couple grew. "Produce an heir," the ministers whispered. But months turned into years, and no child came. To distract herself, Marie sought comfort in music and theater. She had a private stage built at the Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the palace grounds gifted to her by the king. There, far from the judging eyes of the court, she laughed again. She sang. She acted in plays written for her by poets desperate for favor. For a few hours, she could forget that she was a political symbol, and simply be a girl who loved beauty. Yet even in those soft evenings, when candlelight shimmered on silk and laughter filled the air, the whispers did not cease. "She thinks she's an actress," they said. "She spends like a queen before she even wears the crown." And somewhere in the vast corridors of the palace, a letter was being sealed, its wax bearing the crest of Austria. It was addressed to Vienna. To Empress Maria Theresa. Inside were the first reports of her daughter's life in France. The Dauphine is charming, but careless. The people already watch her too closely. The year was 1774, and Versailles woke to the sound of bells. Not the bright, triumphant kind that rang for weddings and victories, these tolled slow and heavy, their echoes rolling across the gardens like a warning. King Louis XV was dead. The courtiers moved through the mirrored halls in hushed procession, their silks whispering like mourning doves. In a single night, everything changed. Marie Antoinette, just 18, found herself Queen of France. The corridors that once shimmered with gossip now bent toward her with reverence and fear. Yet inside, she felt only the weight of silence. Her husband, now Louis XVI, fell to his knees before her in their chambers. His voice trembled. "Dear God, guide us, protect us. We are too young to rule." Marie reached out her hand, resting it lightly on his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes wide, uncertain, almost childlike, and for the first time, she felt tenderness, not impatience. They were both alone now, two young souls adrift in a sea of gold and duty. The next morning, the gates of Versailles opened to thousands of people shouting "Vive le Roi," and Vive la Reine. The sound thrilled her, it felt like love, or something close enough to believe in. She stepped onto the balcony, the wind tugging gently at her pale blue gown, her powdered hair gleaming in the sunlight. The people below seemed like an ocean, endless, alive, and hungry. But beneath the cheers, another murmur was beginning to grow, one she couldn't yet name. In Paris, bread was scarce. In the countryside, fields had failed. And though the Queen waved with a bright, dazzling smile, the people watching from the back of the crowd whispered, "The Austrian will ruin us all." That night, in the quiet of her chamber, Marie stood once again before the mirror. Her crown glittered faintly in the candlelight. She was queen, adored, feared, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. In the early years of her reign, Marie Antoinette's charm was like sunlight spilling into the dark corners of Versailles. The old court, weary from decades of Louis XV's indulgence, found itself dazzled again. The Queen's laughter echoed through the gilded halls, she revived dances, operas, and masked balls. Her taste reshaped the very image of the monarchy, soft pastels replaced heavy velvets, pearls outshone jewels, and powdered wigs grew higher, lighter, and more elaborate. In the ateliers of Paris, milliners and dressmakers whispered her name as both muse and miracle. Her gowns, rivers of silk and lace, became symbols of a new era, one of youth and beauty. When she entered the opera, every fan opened in a flutter. She was not merely a queen, she was France's most dazzling spectacle. But while Versailles sparkled, France beyond its gilded gates dimmed. The treasury strained under debts from wars long past. Bread prices rose, crops failed, and pamphlets, those dangerous little messengers, began to circulate in Parisian cafes. The Queen plays while France starves. They called her Madame Deficit. Unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, Marie retreated further into her own world, a dream of simplicity and freedom. At the Petit Trianon, her private estate, she created a fantasy of pastoral life. There, she dressed as a shepherdess in muslin gowns and straw hats, tending to lambs and milking cows for amusement. It was her sanctuary, a place without politics or pretense. But to the public, it became another insult, a queen playing at poverty while her people had none to live through. At night, the laughter of the court drifted faintly across the palace grounds, mingling with the rustle of the fountains. Marie sat by her window, her reflection caught between candlelight and darkness. Somewhere deep down, a disquiet stirred, a sound not yet loud enough to name, but impossible to ignore. She would later remember these years as her happiest, though they were built upon the quiet cracking of the world beneath her feet. In 1778, the Palace of Versailles swelled with sound, the footsteps of courtiers, the clatter of carriages, the whisper of expectation. After 7 years of waiting, the Queen of France was finally with child. Even the coldest ministers allowed themselves cautious smiles. An air would silence every rumor, every whisper about her marriage. On a cold December morning, the Queen gave birth to a daughter, Marie-Therese Charlotte. Though many had prayed for a son, the people still rejoiced. Bells rang through Paris, crowds filled the streets, celebrating their radiant young mother. When the child was placed in Marie's arms, she wept, tears of relief, joy, and something deeper. In that small, fragile face, she saw her own rebirth. The king, awkward but tender, stood beside her, his eyes soft with pride. For a while, the royal couple seemed closer, gentler, almost ordinary in their happiness. The queen spent hours with her daughter, breaking the stiff customs of the court by nursing her herself, scandalous for a royal, but deeply human. At last, she whispered one evening as she rocked the infant to sleep, "I am not alone." But even as her maternal glow softened her public image, another shadow crept closer. Across France, pamphlets grew crueler, their tone venomous. They mocked her laughter, her dresses, her love of the theater. They painted her not as a mother, but as a temptress, foreign, manipulative, dangerous. The more she smiled, the more they sharpened their pens. At night, when the palace slept, she would sometimes walk through the silent hall of mirrors. Her reflection multiplied endlessly, dozens of queens staring back at her, all dressed in silk, all impossibly young. And in the glimmer of the candlelight, it felt as though each reflection whispered a warning. By 1785, a story began to circulate that would wound her reputation beyond repair, the affair of the diamond necklace. It began, as many scandals do, with greed and misunderstanding. A magnificent diamond necklace, worth more than most noble fortunes, had been crafted for the late king's mistress, Madame du Barry. The jewelers now hoped the new queen would buy it. Marie refused. "I will not wear jewels bought for another woman's pleasure," she said, laughing lightly. She did not know that her refusal would soon twist into a trap. A cunning countess, Jeanne de Lamotte, forged letters, impersonated the queen's handwriting, and convinced Cardinal de Rohan that Marie Antoinette secretly desired the necklace, but wished it purchased in secret. The cardinal, desperate to win back royal favor, agreed and arranged the deal. When the fraud was discovered, the court exploded. Although Marie had no part in it, the people did not believe her. To them, it was proof, the foreign queen obsessed with luxury while they starved. Crowds gathered outside Versailles shouting insults, pamphlets with obscene cartoons circulated through Paris, and the name Marie Antoinette became a curse. The king tried to reassure her, but she knew. A wound had opened between her and her people, one that no crown, no child, no kindness could ever mend. One evening, she looked from her balcony toward the dark horizon where the city lay. "They hate me, Louis," she said softly. "And I do not even know their faces." Below, the fountains of Versailles whispered in the night, still beautiful, still blind. By 1787, the glittering perfection of Versailles had begun to splinter. The courtiers still danced, the candles still burned, but beneath the chandeliers, everyone could feel the tremor of something vast and unseen. In Paris, the word "reform" echoed in every salon. Pamphlets spread like wildfire, demanding justice, equality, bread. Louis XVI, well-meaning but hesitant, called for financial reforms. The nobles resisted. The queen urged him to stand firm, but her Austrian blood made her advice unwelcome. "The queen governs the king," they said in the cafés. "And Austria governs the queen." Within the palace, the mood changed. The music softened, laughter thinned. Even her closest allies began to whisper caution. Marie still hosted evenings at the Petit Trianon, but the laughter felt rehearsed, the smiles heavy. Her friends, the Polignacs, the Lamalice, tried to keep her spirits alive, though each knew they too were targets of the growing resentment outside. Then came the first riots, small, almost unremarkable. A baker's shop destroyed. A noble carriage overturned. To Versailles, they were distant thunder. To the people, they were the first breath of a storm. One afternoon, as Marie walked through her gardens, a servant approached with trembling hands. "Your Majesty, a crowd has gathered in Paris, they shout your name." She smiled faintly, not yet understanding. "Ah," she said, "perhaps they have forgiven me." But the servant did not answer. That night, as she lay awake beside the king, she could hear the faint murmur of wind pressing against the windows, like the breath of the city itself, restless and waiting. It began in July of 1789. The air over Paris was thick with heat and hunger. The Bastille, an ancient fortress and symbol of royal power, stood like a dark tooth against the sky. The people gathered, angry, desperate, armed with whatever they could find. When the prison gates fell, the noise reached Versailles like distant thunder. The king was out hunting when the news came. A messenger, pale and sweating, galloped through the palace gates. Louis read the note, his face draining of color. "Then," he murmured, "it is a revolt." "No, sire," came the reply. "It is a revolution." That evening, as candles flickered against the walls, Marie sat in silence, her embroidery untouched. She could feel the shift, something irreversible had begun. The Bastille's fall was not just the collapse of stone, it was the collapse of centuries. Outside, the gardens were quiet, eerily still. A single leaf broke free from a linden tree and fell at her feet. She watched it drift, light, unresisting, to the marble floor. In the distance, the sky over Paris glowed faintly orange. October 5, 1789. Paris was alive with hunger and anger. The autumn chill pressed through narrow streets, carrying the scent of stale bread and smoke from the ovens. Market women, known as poissards, led the masses, their voices sharp, demanding justice. "Bread! Bread!" they shouted, but the cry carried more than hunger, it carried the weight of decades of famine, unfair taxes, and royal extravagance. News of rising bread prices and the government's inability to respond had spread quickly. At Versailles, Marie Antoinette had been informed of murmurs in Paris, but the reports could not capture the scale of the unrest. By mid-morning, thousands of women and men gathered, armed with pitchforks, knives, and whatever they could find. Their march toward Versailles was unstoppable, fueled by desperation and the memory of past court indifference. The royal family, still adjusting to the sudden weight of power as king and queen, could hardly comprehend the immediacy of the threat. Louis XVI, cautious and hesitant, called his ministers and guards to maintain order, but numbers alone could not quell the crowd. Marie, dressed in silk and pearls, walked through the palace hallways, feeling the tension press on every gilded wall. Servants whispered anxiously, and even her friends, the Polignacs and Lamalice, glanced nervously at the windows. By the late afternoon, the marchers had reached Versailles. They stormed the gates, demanding to see the king and queen. The queen watched from her balcony, her hands trembling slightly as she saw the sheer size of the crowd below, thousands of angry, hungry faces, all staring upward. For the first time, she understood the depth of resentment that had built quietly over the years. It was not just bread, it was the monarchy itself. Her reflection in the gilded mirrors of Versailles now felt foreign, a queen surrounded by beauty, yet at the center of a storm she could neither charm nor control. That night, as the sky darkened and the candles flickered weakly against the tension, Marie realized that the world outside her palace walls was changing irreversibly. The following morning, October 6, 1789, the Queen awoke to reports of the crowd's continued presence. The marchers had entered the palace, moving room to room, their anger palpable. They demanded that the royal family return to Paris. The king hesitated. Louis XVI understood the peril, but feared the optics of force. Marie Antoinette, though terrified, knew that any sudden action could ignite bloodshed. In the Hall of Mirrors, she watched as representatives of the mob met with palace officials. Among the crowd were leaders from Parisian neighborhoods, men and women who had suffered through the failed harvests of 1788, the harsh winter of 1789, and the inequities of feudal taxation. One of their spokesmen, a woman named Théroigne de Méricourt, spoke boldly. The Queen of France must see her people's suffering, not her mirrors. By late afternoon, the royal family agreed to leave Versailles. Marie Antoinette, though escorted carefully by guards, could feel the palpable fear and hatred in the air. Courtiers whispered that the king and queen had underestimated Paris, yet there was no time for reflection. The long carriage ride to Paris felt surreal, the streets filled with an almost oppressive silence, punctuated by distant shouts and the clatter of marching feet. When they arrived at the Tuileries, the palace felt both sanctuary and prison. The royal family had left the glittering isolation of Versailles for a city that now demanded accountability. Marie, stepping from the carriage, saw mothers holding children, eyes wide with hope and anger. She clutched her youngest child to her chest and whispered a silent prayer, feeling the enormity of her responsibility. That night, the Queen could not sleep. From her window, the lights of Paris seemed closer, yet more distant than ever. The grandeur of her crown now felt fragile, almost weightless. She was no longer just Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. She was the focal point of a nation's fury and despair, the living symbol of a monarchy whose survival was uncertain. By late 1789, the new residents at the Tuileries offered little comfort. Paris was tense, the streets alive with discussion of taxes, famine, and reform. Marie Antoinette, once idolized for her beauty and charm, now faced whispers that cut deeper than any blade. Madame Deficit, they called her in pamphlets, blaming her extravagant spending for France's mounting debt. In truth, the monarchy's financial troubles were centuries in the making. Wars under Louis XIV and XV had drained the treasury. The 7 Years' War left France humiliated and bankrupt. Attempts to reform taxation fell on noble resistance, and the peasants bore the burden of feudal dues and tithes. Even as the Queen's gowns grew ever more luxurious, the state's coffers were empty. At the Tuileries, Marie studied ledgers alongside her advisors. She asked questions about grain shortages, trade deficits, and taxation reform. She wanted to help, yet her foreign accent and Austrian heritage alienated her from the French ministers. "You do not understand France," they whispered. Still, she persisted, determined to reconcile beauty with duty. Outside, Paris simmered. Streets filled with cafés, pamphleteers, and political clubs debating the National Assembly's actions. The king struggled to balance authority and caution. Marie saw the anxiety etched on his face and felt her own reflection in it, both of them rulers, yet powerless against the tide of history swelling around them. That evening, she walked the palace gardens, the lamps casting long shadows. Each reflection in the water seemed to whisper, reminding her that wealth and charm could not shield her from reality. Yet in her heart, a quiet defiance grew. She would navigate these storms, not simply submit to them. Winter of 1789 to 1790. Paris froze beneath snow and frost, yet the city's anger burned hotter than ever. Economic disparity, combined with years of poor harvests, created desperation among the common people. Marie Antoinette, observing from her windows at the Tuileries, could see both hope and hostility in their eyes. The Queen attempted to soften public opinion. She organized charitable contributions, funded hospitals, and supported artisans. Yet her gestures were often misunderstood or exaggerated. Rumors spread that she hoarded wealth, even while distributing aid. Courtiers tried to shield her, but pamphlets and caricatures painted her as frivolous, foreign, and out of touch. Within the palace, factions emerged. Ministers debated reforms, the king vacillated, and Marie's inner circle, loyal friends like Madame de Polignac, whispered advice. The Queen's life became a delicate balancing act, maintaining dignity while addressing unrest, performing charm while preparing for political survival. Even the royal children were not spared the tension. Marie-Therese Charlotte and the younger Louis Joseph and Louis Charles witnessed the palace filled with advisors, guards, and the constant whispers of revolution. Marie often held them close at night, telling stories of Austria's peaceful countryside, of gardens and snow, trying to shield their innocence from the storm raging outside. As she lay awake in her chamber, candles burning low, Marie felt the first true weight of isolation. Surrounded by mirrors, courtiers, and gold, she realized that charm and beauty alone could not protect a queen from the anger of her people. The storm had begun, and no palace walls could hold it at bay. By spring of 1790, the Tuileries no longer felt like a sanctuary. Every corridor echoed with whispers, some of loyalty, many of doubt. Courtiers who once bowed with admiration now cast furtive glances, speaking of reform, revolution, and treason. Marie Antoinette sensed the shifting tides, subtle gestures, averted eyes, a servant lingering too long with news from Paris. The Queen tried to maintain grace. She attended assemblies, oversaw her children's education, and continued her private patronage of artists and musicians. Yet, she knew appearances alone could not protect her. Even the king, hesitant and gentle, could not mask his own uncertainty. Ministers debated loudly, sometimes within earshot, whether the monarchy should flee or negotiate. Outside, revolutionary clubs multiplied. The Jacobins and Cordeliers spread ideas of liberty and equality, their words weaving through the streets, reaching every tavern, bakery, and market square. Caricatures of Marie appeared, grotesque, exaggerated, cruel. They called her a spendthrift, an Austrian, a foreign poison in France. Even distant provinces discussed the Queen with a mix of fascination and rage. In her chambers, Marie sat at her desk, reviewing letters from the Crown's diplomats. Some carried requests for action, some reports of unrest. She traced the ink with a trembling finger, feeling the pulse of a kingdom teetering on chaos. Every decision she made could be twisted, every gesture misread. She understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that power was fragile, as fragile as the mirrors lining Versailles, reflecting 1,000 images, yet none entirely true. Summer of 1790. The tension escalated. Food shortages, rising taxes, and political pamphlets left Paris simmering with resentment. Within the Tuileries, the king and queen faced an unprecedented dilemma: how to survive while maintaining dignity and authority. Rumors of plots against the monarchy filled every hallway, whispered by courtiers, attendants, and guards alike. Marie Antoinette, now more cautious, began planning discreetly. The Petit Trianon, once a haven of pastoral leisure, became a refuge for strategy meetings with her closest confidants. She discussed possible retreats, the security of the royal children, and the fragile loyalty of soldiers stationed nearby. Each conversation reminded her that trust had become a rare commodity. The court moved cautiously, adapting daily routines to avoid provocation. Public appearances were limited, private correspondence scrutinized. Even so, Marie could feel the pulse of revolution outside, a force growing with each passing day, feeding on discontent and fear. One evening, as she watched the sun dip behind Parisian rooftops, she whispered to herself, "I am a queen, yet the streets belong to others. I must learn to move with shadows if I am to survive." Her reflection in the Tuileries windows looked pale, regal, yet fragile. The luxurious gowns and pearls could no longer shield her from history's relentless advance. Outside, the city moved with a rhythm of anger and hope, and the monarchy would have to follow, or be swept away entirely. By October 1790, the Tuileries had transformed from a palace of luxury into a fragile citadel of uncertainty. Paris, alive with the restless energy of revolution, sent waves of tension rippling across the city. Rumors of plots against the monarchy reached every gilded corner of the palace, spies disguised as servants, messages hidden in music scores, and courtiers torn between loyalty and self-preservation. Marie Antoinette, once insulated by silk and mirrors, felt the weight of the city pressing upon her. The Queen's days were consumed with careful observation and discreet decisions. Every audience, every handshake, could become a political misstep. She met secretly with loyal advisors such as the Duchesse de Polignac, discussing the loyalty of the Swiss guards and the feasibility of discreet retreats beyond the palace. Outside, Paris seethed. The National Guard, formed under Lafayette, patrolled the streets, symbolizing both order and revolutionary vigilance. The monarchy's power seemed to exist in a delicate balance, a fragile bubble ready to burst. Marie Antoinette spent her mornings attending to her children, Marie-Therese, Louis-Joseph, and Louis-Charles, teaching them reading, music, and French etiquette. Their laughter, soft and innocent, was a small comfort against the growing storm. In the afternoons, she walked the Tuileries gardens, her silk skirts brushing against autumn leaves, reflecting on the delicate threads connecting her life to the city she ruled. News arrived daily of unrest, artisans striking, bread riots in the Marais district, and pamphlets accusing the Queen of extravagant waste. One report, carried by a trembling messenger, described a mob surrounding the home of a loyalist noble, demanding his resignation. Another detailed the formation of revolutionary committees in neighboring towns, signaling that the unrest had begun to spread beyond Paris. At night, Marie would sit by her window overlooking the Seine. The city lights shimmered in the water, beautiful yet tainted by the distant sounds of unrest. She thought of her mother in Vienna, of the teachings of her youth, and of her own naivety. For the first time, she realized that charm, beauty, and maternal warmth could not shield her from the relentless force of history. Winter 1790 to 1791. The air in Paris was bitter, carrying not only frost but the growing anger of the people. Economic hardship, combined with a rising awareness of inequality, fed revolutionary fervor. The Queen's reputation, already tarnished by the affair of the diamond necklace, suffered further blows. Pamphlets depicted her as a foreign seductress, a manipulative force plotting against the nation, while her charitable acts were twisted into evidence of arrogance and disconnect. Inside the palace, whispers of treason grew louder. Some courtiers urged Marie Antoinette to flee to the countryside, or even to Austria, seeking safety for herself and her children. Others insisted she remain, presenting a brave face to maintain public favor. The Queen walked these corridors like a dancer on a narrow ledge. One wrong step could shatter everything. Outside, the revolutionary clubs, such as the Jacobins and Cordeliers, spread pamphlets and organized meetings. Women, especially, became politically active. The Poissards of 1789 now inspired a generation of female voices demanding justice, bread, and equality. The king, hesitant and indecisive, relied increasingly on Marie's counsel, though he feared her foreign heritage would make her unpopular. The Queen's private moments became her refuge. She walked the Petit Trianon, feeding the lambs, wandering the miniature gardens, and reflecting on the past. Here, in the quiet, she remembered her childhood in Vienna, the laughter of her siblings, and the lessons from her mother, Empress Maria Theresa. Yet even these moments of peace were pierced by the knowledge that the streets below simmered with anger, and that Versailles itself could no longer shelter her family. By candlelight, she traced her fingers over letters from loyal nobles, diplomats, and advisers, considering the next steps. Could the monarchy survive? Could she survive? Each decision seemed weighted with the fate of thousands. She realized that every smile in the Hall of Mirrors, every gown of silk, and every public gesture would now carry the burden of expectation and suspicion. That night, as snow fell lightly on the palace gardens, Marie Antoinette looked out over the city. Paris was beautiful, terrible, alive. She whispered into the darkness, "History watches us. I must find the strength to endure, for myself, for my children, and for France." By early 1791, Louis XVI found himself trapped between his personal hesitation and the relentless pressure of history. The National Assembly, now the de facto government of France, had begun drafting reforms that diminished the monarchy's power. Taxes were being reorganized, noble privileges curtailed, and the people demanded transparency. The king, uncertain and indecisive, often sought counsel from Marie Antoinette. The Queen, though criticized publicly for extravagance, understood the political currents better than many around her. She advised caution, urging the king to appear agreeable while maintaining some authority. Yet every word, every gesture, was scrutinized. Courtiers whispered behind her back, "The Austrian meddles too much. The king is weak because of her." Meanwhile, the streets of Paris were a theater of tension. Artisans, shopkeepers, and workers gathered daily to discuss revolutionary ideas, pamphlets spreading faster than the postal service could track. Clubs like the Jacobins organized meetings where the Queen's image was repeatedly vilified. Caricatures depicted her in grotesque fashions, exaggerating every feature, transforming charm into threat. Even her acts of charity were framed as deceit, feeding the idea that the monarchy was indifferent to suffering. The royal children, now growing older, became symbolic pawns. Marie-Therese, bright and cautious, observed her mother's anxiety and her father's indecision. Young Louis Charles, innocent but perceptive, watched the palace guards and whispered questions about the crowds below. Marie Antoinette, while tender and loving, recognized that they too were under the gaze of history, their upbringing politicized by circumstance. At night, the Queen wandered the corridors of the Tuileries, the reflection of candlelight dancing on mirrors and gilded surfaces. She traced the ornate patterns with her fingertips, feeling the fragility of appearances. Every decision, from wardrobe to words, carried weight. In the silence of the palace, she whispered to herself, "We must endure. We must survive." History is patient, but it does not forgive mistakes. By June 1791, unrest had escalated into a crisis that would define the monarchy. The king and queen, along with their children, planned to flee Paris, to reach Montmartre, where loyalist troops awaited. The plan was secret, the carriages disguised, and every detail calculated with meticulous care. Marie Antoinette insisted on taking only essential items, though her beloved jewels, documents, and clothing still accompanied her. On the night of June 20th to 21st, the royal family departed the Tuileries under the cover of darkness. Guards and servants accompanied them, hearts pounding, eyes alert for any sign of trouble. The journey through the countryside, however, was fraught with danger. Word of their departure spread faster than anticipated, and local officials became suspicious. At St. Ménehould, the royal family was recognized by a postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, who rode quickly to alert authorities. By dawn, the king and queen were stopped in Varennes, just a few miles from Montmartre. Guards surrounded them, and the realization hit: their attempt at escape had failed. Back in Paris, the news ignited fury and despair. The king's credibility collapsed. The queen, already vilified, became the embodiment of betrayal in the eyes of revolutionaries. Caricatures and pamphlets spread rapidly, calling her a schemer, a traitor, a foreign Austrian plotting against France. The streets, once murmuring with unrest, now roared with accusation and indignation. At the Tuileries, Marie Antoinette sat quietly in her chamber, her children beside her. The silence of the palace was heavy, almost suffocating. She looked at Louis XVI, seeing the weight of failure mirrored in his eyes. The golden halls, the mirrors, the gardens, all had become symbols of a monarchy on the brink. Outside, Paris did not sleep. The people were awake, watching, waiting, and the world Marie Antoinette had known had shifted irreversibly. The morning after the failed flight, June 22, 1791, Versailles felt like a gilded cage. The royal family returned to the Tuileries, but their world had irrevocably changed. The people's trust was shattered. Letters and pamphlets flooded Paris, denouncing the king as weak and the queen as a traitor. Caricatures exaggerated Marie Antoinette's face, her eyes cold, her crown tilted, portraying her as plotting against France while its citizens starved. Inside the palace, Marie Antoinette moved cautiously. Every gesture, every word, was now scrutinized by guards, ministers, and spies alike. She could no longer walk through the halls freely, Whispers followed her, rumors of secret correspondence with Austria making her every decision suspect. Her private moments became rarer, reading letters from loyalists, comforting her children, or simply walking through the gardens now felt weighted with danger. Louis XVI faced mounting pressure from the National Assembly, which demanded accountability. The king was forced to accept measures limiting his authority, while Marie Antoinette bore the brunt of public outrage. Even within her closest circle, doubts began to fester. Friends and courtiers advised caution, but fear shadowed every conversation. The Tuileries, once a palace of splendor and influence, now felt like a gilded prison. Outside Paris, the news spread like wildfire. Nobles in the provinces debated the Queen's intentions. Revolutionary clubs in Paris called for her trial or exile. Her Austrian lineage, once a symbol of diplomatic alliance, now became a mark of foreign interference. Every newspaper, every pamphlet, every street corner conversation seemed designed to erode her image. At night, Marie Antoinette sat by the windows of the Tuileries, staring at the city lights. Paris was alive with fury, yet she could sense the fragile thread of loyalty that still existed among some citizens and soldiers. Clutching her children close, she whispered, "History watches us. We must endure, even when the world believes we are lost." The summer of 1791 brought no respite. The failure at Varennes intensified public anger. Revolutionary committees held assemblies in Parisian squares, discussing the monarchy's crimes in impassioned speeches. Marie Antoinette became the central figure of these debates, her name invoked as both a warning and a rallying cry. At the Tuileries, life continued under constant surveillance. Guards watched every entrance, messengers brought reports of unrest, petitions, and conspiracies. Courtiers whispered of a queen whose charm was now powerless, whose beauty could not disguise political vulnerability. Marie Antoinette felt the sting of isolation. Even her closest companions, such as the Duchesse de Polignac and the Princesse de la Mallet, could offer only limited counsel against a growing tide of hostility. Yet she did not yield. In private chambers, she taught her children reading, arithmetic, and history. She instructed them gently, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the cacophony of revolution outside. Every lesson, every lullaby, became an act of defiance, a promise of continuity, of survival. Public opinion, however, remained merciless. Caricatures showed the Queen with exaggerated features, often with Austrian symbols, implying treachery. Pamphlets accused her of hoarding wealth while the people starved. Even acts of charity were twisted into propaganda. Distributing food became proof of indulgence. Hosting musical performances was interpreted as mockery of national suffering. In these quiet moments, Marie Antoinette realized that her survival depended not only on political strategy but on endurance. The Tuileries had become both a fortress and a prison. The outside world watched, judged, and waited. Alone with her thoughts and her children, she whispered into the candlelight, "We are a family, and we must hold together, even when the storm breaks at our doors." By late 1791, Paris had transformed into a city under siege, though no cannon fired upon its streets, yet. The National Guard, led by Lafayette, patrolled the boulevards, ostensibly to maintain order, yet their presence was a constant reminder of the monarchy's precarious position. Marie Antoinette, observing from the Tuileries windows, felt a mixture of fascination and dread. These men were loyal to France, not to her, and each passing hour tested the fragile bond between sovereign and citizen. Daily life within the palace had grown tense. Courtiers tiptoed through gilded halls, measuring their words, fearful that a misplaced comment could be construed as loyalty to counter-revolutionary factions. Marie Antoinette, once surrounded by laughter and music, now moved in careful silence. Even the Queen's laughter, previously a balm to anxious courtiers, seemed dangerous, an echo of frivolity to outsiders. Outside, Paris simmered. Revolutionary clubs, pamphleteers, and journalists chronicled every gesture of the royal family. A simple carriage ride could spark suspicion, a charitable act could be painted as mockery. The Queen's Austrian heritage was invoked at every opportunity, linking her with foreign threats in the minds of radicals. Marie understood this peril, yet she could not abandon her role as mother, as wife, as queen. She moved between public appearances and private instruction for her children with meticulous care, knowing each step could shape perception, loyalty, or hatred. By night, the Queen kept vigil at the windows. Candlelight flickered across her face, casting shadows that mirrored the unrest outside. The Seine flowed silently beneath, reflecting both the palace and the city, a symbol of beauty and danger intertwined. Every letter from Paris carried intelligence, rumors, or warnings. Every whisper in the corridors of the Tuileries could signal betrayal. As she gazed upon the sleeping city, she whispered, almost to herself, "I am trapped between duty and survival." Every move is watched. Every word recorded. We must endure, for France, for our children, for the monarchy itself. By early 1792, the royal family's circle of trust had narrowed dramatically. Loyal nobles either fled the country or kept silent, fearful of revolutionary reprisal. Marie Antoinette's closest allies, including the Duchesse de Polignac and the Princesse de Lamallais, were constantly on edge, aware that their positions could become dangerous at any moment. Letters from Austria arrived intermittently, offering counsel but also reminding her of the geopolitical stakes entwined with her very existence. The Queen's daily life became a series of calculated movements. She supervised her children's education, oversaw correspondence, and tried to maintain decorum in court affairs, all while observing the increasing unrest in Paris. Food shortages, protests, and radical pamphlets became routine. Newspapers accused her of plotting with émigré nobles, of conspiring to undermine revolutionary reforms, of hoarding wealth. Even the smallest indulgence, a musical recital, a garden stroll, could be reframed as contemptuous frivolity. Tension within the palace escalated. Guards whispered among themselves, questioning their loyalty. Ministers debated policies that the king had little authority to enforce. Marie Antoinette felt a profound isolation. She moved silently through the corridors, aware of every eye, every ear, every whisper. The gilded walls of the Tuileries, once symbols of security, now felt like a cage. At night, she would often sit with her children, teaching them quietly while the distant murmur of Paris drifted through the palace windows. Even in these private moments, she could feel history pressing close, a relentless weight that would not be ignored. She whispered softly to herself, the words barely audible, "We must endure. We must hold together. And we must survive, no matter the cost." By the spring of 1792, Paris had become a city on edge. The economic crisis that had plagued France for decades now reached a boiling point. Food shortages were acute. Bread, once a staple, had become a luxury for many. The revolutionary fervor of 1789 had evolved into organized political action, with clubs such as the Jacobins, Cordeliers, and Feuillants debating, planning, and pressuring the monarchy at every turn. Marie Antoinette, from her vantage at the Tuileries, observed the chaos with a mixture of anxiety and calculation. The Queen had long been criticized for her Austrian heritage and perceived extravagance, yet her private life had always sought to balance luxury with maternal care and charitable acts. Now, every gesture, from hosting music lessons for her children to attending court functions, was politicized. Caricatures in newspapers portrayed her as a manipulative foreigner conspiring with counter-revolutionaries. The infamous nickname, Madame Deficit, followed her relentlessly. Inside the palace, tension grew palpable. Ministers debated reforms, often in heated arguments that left Louis XVI hesitant and indecisive. Guards were on constant alert, aware that popular anger could turn violent. Marie Antoinette's closest confidants, the Duchesse de Polignac and the Princesse de Lamallais, attempted to maintain calm, yet even their loyalty could not shield her from the growing sense of isolation. Courtiers whispered of plots, suggesting that the Queen herself might need to flee or negotiate secretly with foreign powers to ensure her family's survival. Beyond the palace walls, Paris was alive with unrest. Revolutionary committees monitored every street, every household, every noble who remained. Pamphlets accusing the Queen of conspiracy were circulated widely, often containing false information yet carrying a powerful emotional impact. The people's anger was not directed solely at the monarchy's wealth, it was anger rooted in centuries of inequality, famine, and frustration with a system they felt had ignored their suffering. At night, Marie Antoinette walked the long corridors of the Tuileries, listening to the distant shouts from Paris. The candlelight cast dancing shadows on the gilded walls, and in those shadows, she could feel the weight of history pressing against her. The Queen whispered to herself, a quiet mantra against fear, "I must endure. I must protect my children. I must navigate the currents of a world that no longer bends to my will." By June 1792, the storm had reached the palace gates. Parisian mobs, emboldened by months of unrest, began assembling outside the Tuileries. The National Guard, previously a symbol of order, wavered in loyalty, torn between protecting the monarchy and aligning with revolutionary ideals. Louis XVI's authority was questioned daily, both by the people and by his own ministers. Every decision now carried profound risk. A wrong step could ignite violence, a delayed action could be interpreted as cowardice. Marie Antoinette's days became a careful choreography. She oversaw her children's lessons, inspected the palace, and consulted secretly with trusted advisors on security measures. The Queen's wardrobe, her movements, even her facial expressions were scrutinized by spies, newspapers, and Parisian citizens eager for evidence of her guilt or frivolity. She could no longer walk the gardens freely, each step was measured, calculated, defensive. Outside, the streets were alive with tension. Artisans, market women, and radical citizens patrolled the outskirts of the palace, shouting slogans demanding accountability and bread. The revolutionary press described the Queen in grotesque exaggeration, portraying her as plotting with Austrian and émigré forces against France. Even charitable acts, once a source of private pride, were twisted into propaganda. Feeding the poor became proof of manipulation, musical performances evidence of detachment from suffering. The night brought little comfort. From her private chambers, Marie Antoinette watched the shadows of Paris stretch across the Seine. The palace seemed both fortress and cage, gilded halls now echoing with unease. The queen felt the isolation acutely. Trusted allies whispered in hushed tones, their loyalty overshadowed by fear. The children slept nearby, oblivious to the dangers that encircled them, their innocence a fragile shield against the relentless pressure of history. The queen's thoughts turned to survival. Every glance, every word, every gesture was a negotiation with an uncertain world. She whispered to herself, "The walls may protect us, but they cannot stop history. We must endure. We must protect our family. And we must survive, even as the world we knew crumbles." By the late summer of 1792, the atmosphere inside the Tuileries had shifted from uneasy caution to outright dread. The royal family was no longer merely the subject of gossip or pamphlets, they had become the tangible focus of revolutionary anger. Marie Antoinette, whose beauty and charm had once enchanted courts across Europe, now felt their power eroded by fear. Every visitor, every messenger, every passing glance carried the weight of suspicion. The king's indecision left Marie with a sense of isolation. Ministers argued heatedly about reforms, some advocating compromise, others warning of revolt. Louis XVI, hesitant to take decisive action, often left the queen to navigate these dangerous waters. She spent hours reading reports from provincial towns, noting unrest, strikes, and the spread of revolutionary clubs. Even the Swiss guards, loyal by oath, displayed unease as the people's fury crept closer to the palace gates. Outside, Paris had transformed into a city of tension and anticipation. Revolutionary committees organized daily, monitoring noble houses, patrolling streets, and ensuring that citizens were prepared to act at the first sign of royal defiance. Pamphlets circulated depicting the queen as a foreign schemer, an Austrian agent conspiring with émigrés to overthrow the nascent revolution. Her charitable works were twisted into propaganda, as if feeding the hungry were a deliberate mockery of the nation's suffering. Marie Antoinette moved carefully through the palace corridors. Every gesture, every word, every facial expression was a potential statement. She guided her children's education, emphasizing French history, literature, and music, trying to maintain normalcy amidst chaos. Yet even these quiet moments were tinged with fear. She often paused by the windows, gazing at the Seine, the distant hum of the city echoing in her ears. Every night, she whispered to herself, "We are surrounded. Every choice may be our last. We must endure, for the children, for the family, for the legacy of the crown." By late August, the queen noticed a subtle shift among the guards. Whispers of disloyalty and hesitation circulated, fueled by the revolutionary clubs outside. Even the palace servants, once obedient and attentive, moved with a nervous tension, unsure whom they could trust. Marie Antoinette's isolation deepened, allies were few, dangers many, and the threat of violence always looming. September 1792. Paris was no longer a city of murmurs, it had become a place of action. Reports of royal plots, émigré activity, and counter-revolutionary schemes spread like wildfire. Revolutionary leaders demanded accountability, the people's fury had grown, and the National Assembly's authority increasingly overshadowed the king's. Inside the Tuileries, life was a careful choreography of appearances and secrecy. Marie Antoinette moved from room to room, attending to her children, consulting with loyal courtiers, and managing correspondence with both French and foreign allies. Every word written, every audience granted, was a calculated step through a minefield of suspicion. The Queen understood that her Austrian origins made her an easy target, her loyalty was constantly questioned, and she was portrayed as manipulating France for foreign gain. The palace itself, once a symbol of grandeur, now felt fragile. Guards patrolled the corridors in heightened alert, courtiers whispered urgently, and servants moved silently, aware that even the smallest error could have catastrophic consequences. The gardens, fountains, and gilded halls were beautiful, yet their opulence seemed to mock the turmoil outside. Marie Antoinette often walked these spaces alone, her thoughts drifting to her children, to her homeland, and to the stark reality that Paris was no longer a city she could command, only observe. Outside, revolutionary mobs gathered near the Tuileries gates. Pamphleteers stirred anger, merchants and artisans voiced grievances, and even some soldiers began to question where their loyalty should lie. Every morning brought new reports of unrest, every night a chorus of whispers and distant shouts. Marie's heart ached not just for herself, but for her children, whose innocence was threatened by the tidal wave of history sweeping through France. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the palace halls, the Queen paused by her children's chambers. She kissed their foreheads, whispered words of comfort, and silently resolved to protect them at all costs. Candlelight reflected in her eyes, a mixture of fear, determination, and quiet defiance. In the stillness of the palace, she murmured, "The storm approaches, and yet we must stand. We must endure. History may judge us, but we will survive as long as we remain together." By late August 1792, the tension surrounding the Tuileries reached a breaking point. Paris had transformed into a city of insurrection. Rumors of royal conspiracies and foreign invasions, combined with growing desperation among the populace, ignited fury. Revolutionary mobs marched with determination, their chants echoing through narrow streets, reaching the palace gates with an ominous resonance. Inside the Tuileries, Marie Antoinette moved carefully through the gilded corridors. Every sound, a whisper, a shuffle, a sudden footstep, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. Guards, loyal yet increasingly nervous, were posted at every entrance. Courtiers, some loyal, some merely cautious, whispered strategies and warnings in hushed tones. The Queen's Austrian origins made her the target of every revolutionary accusation. Caricatures and pamphlets outside depicted her as a foreign schemer orchestrating the downfall of France, while her every act, even attending to her children, was twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Marie Antoinette spent the morning with her children, emphasizing lessons of history, literature, and music. She tried to maintain calm, though the air outside vibrated with unrest. Every carriage that passed, every distant shout, reminded her that the palace walls could not shield them forever. She paused at the windows, gazing across the Seine, and whispered, "We are at the mercy of a city I once loved. Yet I must endure. I must protect my family." The insurrection escalated swiftly. Revolutionary forces breached outer defenses, mobs pressed toward the gates, and the king's authority waned before the eyes of all. The queen, though terrified, moved with deliberate composure, organizing her family, giving instructions to loyal guards, and attempting to shield her children from the chaos. For the first time, the reality of Paris as a city in rebellion pressed directly upon her. No pamphlet, no rumor, could have prepared her for this tangible threat. The afternoon brought a storm of noise, fear, and confrontation. Revolutionary crowds surrounded the Tuileries, demanding access, demanding justice, demanding the king and queen acknowledge the sovereignty of the people. Guards resisted, but hesitation crept in. Some faltered, others whispered among themselves, unsure whether loyalty to the crown outweighed allegiance to the city and revolution. Marie Antoinette, moving quietly through the palace, oversaw preparations. She coordinated with the Swiss guards, ensuring the children were kept safe, instructing attendants, and maintaining appearances of dignity. The queen's composure, however, masked an inner storm of fear and calculation. Every moment could determine survival or death, loyalty or betrayal. Outside, Parisian radicals clashed with the guards. Stones flew, cries echoed, and the palace walls trembled with the energy of revolt. The queen, observing from her chambers, understood the symbolic power of this moment. The monarchy, once absolute, now teetered on the precipice of irrelevance. She whispered words of reassurance to the king, though her own heart pounded with terror. In the private chambers, Marie Antoinette gathered her children, holding them close as the sounds of the city invaded the palace. Candlelight flickered across their faces, the shadows long and ominous. She whispered, "No matter what happens outside, we remain a family. We endure together. This storm will test us, but we shall not break." By evening, the tumult outside had settled into tense silence, though the threat had not vanished. Paris had tested the monarchy, the Tuileries had withstood the immediate insurrection, but the queen knew that history was relentless. Every action, every word, every glance from that moment onward would be judged by the people, by Europe, and by posterity. Marie Antoinette sat quietly in the private chambers with her children, reflecting on the events of the past years, her arrival in France as a young archduchess, the glittering balls and courtly duties, the first signs of unrest, the flight to Varennes, the failures of diplomacy, and now the violent assertion of revolutionary will. Her Austrian upbringing, her beauty, and her role as mother had intersected with history in ways both tragic and instructive. The Queen's final thoughts of the day were slow, deliberate, and soft, almost like a lullaby. We endure. We survive. History watches us, and we must carry ourselves with courage and care. The world outside is turbulent, yet within these walls, and within our hearts, there is still light, still life, still hope. The children slept, the palace quieted, and the candles flickered in the night. Marie Antoinette, though weary and fearful, resolved that endurance was her greatest act of sovereignty. She had survived the insurrection, guided her family through fear, and preserved the dignity of the crown as best she could. And in the quiet of the Tuileries, with Paris breathing and plotting beyond the walls, she whispered one final promise to herself and her children: we will endure, no matter what comes next. As the candles dim and the palace grows silent, remember that history is alive with stories waiting to be discovered. Marie Antoinette and her children have endured, yet the streets of Paris remain restless. Thank you for joining this slow journey into the past. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and stay with us for more mesmerizing tales of kings, queens, and the worlds they once ruled. Good night, and let the whispers of history carry you to dream.